She was left at the fort for being half-blood, but he said, "That half is the part I chose." A story of Jesse James. Part 1, Left Behind. The morning they left her, the sky was the color of a bad wound. Elara Whitehorse stood at the edge of Fort Caldwell's wooden gates and watched the wagon train she traveled with for 3 weeks roll away into the Kansas dust without her. She didn't cry. Crying was something she'd stopped doing around the same age. She'd learned that her mother's Cheyenne blood made certain doors close before she even reached them. She was 22 years old, half Cheyenne and half Irish, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had paid good money she'd earned washing laundry in Abilene for 6 months to ride with the Hollies family train all the way to Colorado. She had a letter in her coat pocket, written in her father's hand before his lungs gave out last spring, directing her to a mining claim near Pueblo that was supposedly worth something. But Mr. Hollies had decided 3 weeks into the journey, and one day before they were due to leave Fort Caldwell, that he didn't want to be responsible for a half-breed girl the rest of the way. His wife had agreed. His 3 grown sons had said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The fort's commanding officer, a lieutenant named Carey, had taken pity on her enough to let her stay one night in the women's quarters. One night. After that, he'd shrugged with the helpless look of a man who knew something was wrong but didn't intend to let it be his problem. So here she stood. The fort had perhaps 40 soldiers, a blacksmith, 2 traders, and a saloon that wasn't quite a saloon because the army didn't officially sanction drinking. There was also, at present, a group of 7 rough-looking men camped just outside the fort's eastern wall, whose horses were better fed than most of the soldiers. Elara had noticed the horses first. A woman who'd grown up on the edge of Cheyenne territory learned to notice horses before she noticed men. Horses told you more, and they didn't lie. She picked up her one bag, straightened her coat, and walked toward the trading post to ask if there was any work. She didn't see him until the afternoon. She'd spent the morning speaking with a trader named Oakes who told her not unkindly, but with the frank arithmetic of a businessman, that he already had a boy doing his stockwork and couldn't pay another hand. He'd offered her a meal in compensation for her time, which she accepted without pride, because hunger was a thing she respected too much to let pride overrule it. She was eating salt pork and cornbread at the end of the trading post's long table when the door opened, and 3 of the men from the eastern camp walked in. She'd seen their type before. She kept her eyes on her plate. But one of them paused near her end of the table. "You're not a soldier," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up. He was taller than she'd expected from a distance, lean through the shoulders in that way men get when they've spent years moving fast and sleeping on hard ground. His hair was dark brown and needed cutting. His eyes were blue-gray, the color of river water before a storm, and they were looking at her with a directness that she found difficult to name. Not threatening. Not the kind of look that made her hand move toward the small knife she kept in her boot. Just direct, like he was actually seeing her. "No," she said, "I'm not." "You came with the Hollies train." "I left with the Hollies train," she said. "There's a difference." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose there is." He pulled out the bench across from her and sat down without being invited. His 2 companions drifted toward the far end of the room with the practiced ease of men who knew when to give their boss space. "Jesse," he said, offering his hand across the table. She looked at the hand, then at him. "Elara." She didn't shake it immediately, not out of rudeness, but because she'd learned that accepting a stranger's hand too quickly told them something about your desperation. She finished chewing her cornbread. Then she shook it. His grip was firm and brief, professional almost. "You're heading to Colorado," he said. "Pueblo, I have a mining claim." "A woman alone." "I was alone before the Hollies family too. I managed." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with that same flat, assessing look. Up close she could see a faint scar that ran through his left eyebrow, old and healed silver, and the particular stillness that some men carried, the kind that wasn't peace, but was something adjacent to it, the stillness of a person who had learned to be very quiet because the world hadn't given them the luxury of noise. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" he asked. She looked at him. "That's not what I mean," he said, and from his tone she believed him. "The fort's turning you out. I saw Carrie talking to you this morning." "I'll find something." "We're camped east of the wall. There's space." He paused. "My word that you'll be left alone." "Your word," she said. "And what's your word worth, Jesse?" He considered this, with what seemed like genuine respect for the question. "I've broken it twice in my life," he said. "Once to a man who'd earned the breaking, once to the federal government, which I don't count." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded and stood. "We're there if you decide yes." He moved toward his men at the far end of the room, and it was only when she heard Oakes draw in a sharp breath that she glanced at the trader and saw the look on his face. "Do you know who that is?" Oakes whispered. She shook her head. Oakes leaned across the counter. "Jesse James." Elara looked at the door where the man had just passed through. She thought about the directness of his eyes, the 2 short sentences about his broken word. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket and the claim in Pueblo, and the fact that she had $4.30 to her name and no way west. She finished her cornbread. Part 2, the camp east of the wall. She decided yes. She told herself it was practical. Jesse James and his men were heading west. Everyone in the camp seemed to know this, spoken in the low, sideways way that people discussed dangerous things. She needed to go west. She had nothing worth stealing, and she'd spent enough time on the frontier to know that a woman alone between forts on open Kansas prairie was in considerably more danger than a woman riding with 7 armed men who had a reputation that preceded them like a thunderhead. She also told herself she wasn't afraid of him. She packed her bag at dusk and walked east of the wall. The camp was organized with a military efficiency that surprised her. Horses picketed in a line, bedrolls placed with purpose, a fire built small and smokeless. The men looked up when she walked in, and she read their faces in the same quick way she read strangers in any new place. Assessing threat, assessing curiosity, assessing the specific kind of judgment she'd carried on her skin her whole life. She got some of that last one. A sandy-haired man near the fire looked her over with the particular squint of someone performing arithmetic. But a broad-shouldered man with a red beard raised a hand in a greeting that seemed genuine, and a young one barely older than a boy just moved over on his log to make room. Jesse James was sitting apart, cleaning his revolver with the focused attention of a craftsman. He didn't look up immediately, but she had the sense that he'd registered exactly where she was from the moment she entered the camp. "You came," he said. "I said I'd think about it." "You thought fast." "I'm efficient." The red-bearded man laughed. Jesse glanced at him, and the laugh subsided, but not unhappily. It had the quality of long familiarity, men who'd been through enough together that small jokes could live in a look. "Cole," Jesse said, nodding toward the red-bearded man, "we'll show you where to set up. You eat with us, you ride when we ride. If we move fast, you keep up. Any questions, you ask me." "What do I owe you for the passage?" she asked. He looked up from the revolver then. "Nothing. I don't ride on charity." "It's not charity. An extra rider confuses the headcount for anyone tracking us." He held her gaze. "It's useful to me. That make it easier." She thought about it. "Yes," she said. She learned their names over the next 3 days as they moved west across Kansas. Cole Younger, the red-bearded man, was Jesse's lieutenant, and something like his conscience they argued in the specific shorthand of men who'd known each other since boyhood, and Jesse always listened to him even when he disagreed. The young one was Charlie Pitts, barely 19 and trying hard not to show how young he was. The others, Jim, Frank, 2 men named Wood and Harlan, were quieter, professional, courteous in the manner of men who'd been told to be. Frank James was Jesse's brother. She recognized the resemblance before anyone told her the same river-water eyes, though Frank's were more careful and less direct. Where Jesse moved through the world with a kind of compressed energy, Frank had the measured calm of someone who'd made peace with something difficult a long time ago. He was the one who spoke to her most naturally in those first days. "You're Cheyenne?" he asked on the second morning, handing her coffee. "Half my mother was. My father was Irish from Galway." "That's a long way to come to die in Kansas." "He survived Kansas. It was the coal dust in a Denver mine that got him." Frank nodded. "Colorado man." "He was, and I aim to be." "Jesse said you've got a mining claim." "I do." Frank was quiet for a moment, watching the horizon. "He doesn't bring people along for no reason," he said. "I've seen him leave behind men he'd known for years when they'd become a liability. The fact that he offered, he stopped. Never mind. Drink your coffee." She drank her coffee, but she turned the sentence over in her mind for the rest of the day. She noticed things about Jesse James that she suspected most people didn't. He read. He carried 2 books in his saddlebag, a Bible, which she'd expected, and a battered collection of Lord Byron's poetry, which she had not. She caught him with it on the 3rd night, reading by firelight with the same focused attention he gave his revolver. "Byron," she said. He looked up without embarrassment. "You know him?" "My father read him. She walks in beauty." Jesse was quiet a moment. Then he recited from memory. "She walks in beauty, like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes." He said it the way a man might say a prayer, not for show, but because the words meant something. She looked at him across the fire. This man the newspapers had been writing dark legends about for a decade. This wanted man with a price on his head and blood on his history, reading Byron in the dark Kansas night. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Something simpler." He closed the book. "Most people prefer simple. It makes things easier." "For them?" "Yes, for them." He looked at her steadily. "What did Holly say when he left you at the fort?" The question came without preamble. She'd noticed he did that, ask things directly, without the social cushioning most people layered around difficult subjects. "He said he hadn't signed on to be responsible for someone who'd caused trouble," she said. "Caused trouble how?" "He didn't specify. He didn't have to." She met his gaze. "You know the kind of trouble he meant." Jesse was quiet for a moment. In the fire's light his face was difficult to read, but she thought she saw something move behind his eyes, not pity, which she would have resented, but something harder and colder, the look of a man filing information away. "Holly's is a coward," he said. "Most of them are." "Yes," he said, "most of them are." Part 3. What happened at the river? 4 days out of Fort Caldwell, they came to a crossing on the Smoky Hill River that was higher than expected from the spring runoff. The horses could make it barely, but it would mean going in deep, saddlebags lifted, rifles held over heads. They were discussing the crossing when 3 riders appeared on the southern bank. Elara read them before anyone spoke, the way they sat their horses, the angle of their hats. The too casual arrangement that wasn't casual at all. "Jesse," she said quietly. He'd already seen them. His hand had gone still at his side in that particular way, not reaching for the gun, just resting near it. The 3 riders were Pinkerton men. She'd seen enough of them in Denver and Abilene to recognize the breed, federal bounty hunters dressed as civilians, which they thought was clever, and which anyone with experience saw through immediately. "How'd they find us this fast?" Cole muttered. "Someone at the fort," Frank said. The lead Pinkerton man called across the water. "Jesse Woodson James, you are wanted by the—" "I know what I'm wanted for," Jesse called back pleasantly. I've heard the speech. Come across peaceful, and no one needs to get hurt. Elara's eyes moved across the far bank, counting angles and exits. There was a stand of cottonwoods 50 yards east. The ford here was the only reasonable crossing for 4 miles in either direction. The Pinkerton men would have companions, she was almost certain, somewhere in those cottonwoods. She leaned toward Jesse, the trees on the east. He cut his eyes to her, then to the cottonwoods. Something sharpened in his expression. How many? I don't know, but if I were setting this, that's where I'd put them. He looked at her for one long second, assessing, recalculating, and then he nodded. What happened next happened quickly. Jesse's men split and moved with the practiced fluency of people who drilled this kind of scatter 100 times. Elara moved when Cole moved, following his lead, angling north along the bank away from the trees. Shots came from the cottonwoods. She'd been right. There were 2 more men there, and then the world was noise and river spray and the flat crack of gunfire, and she was low on her horse's neck and moving. She didn't fire. She didn't have a rifle, but she watched angles, memorized positions, called out what she saw to Cole beside her. 2 men, the far cottonwood, moving east, and Cole acted on it with the quick trust of a man who'd learned to use good information when it appeared. It was over in 6 minutes. No one on their side was hit. One Pinkerton man was down with a leg wound. The others had retreated south. Jesse's men reassembled on the north bank with the quiet efficiency of people who'd survived this kind of thing before. Jesse rode up beside her. He was breathing hard, but his face was composed. You called that right, he said. I've been reading landscapes since I was 8 years old, she said. My mother's people taught me. You learn to see where danger hides. He looked at her for a long moment. That's a gift, he said. It kept me alive. That's all I needed it to be. They crossed the river 2 miles north and made camp early, letting the horses rest. That night, around the fire, the men were quieter than usual, the particular quiet that comes after near violence, when the body is still measuring what it just escaped. Jesse sat beside her, not close, the appropriate distance of a man keeping his word, but beside her in the way of someone who'd made a choice about where to be. The Holly's family will be in Colorado by now, he said. Probably. They'll never know what they left behind. She looked at him. What did they leave behind? A woman who can read a cottonwood stand at 50 yards and count threats in the dark. He paused. That's worth something, more than they deserved. She thought about the words for a moment. You say things like that simply, she said. Like they're just facts. They are facts. Most people don't see them that way. He was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. I grew up in Missouri during the war, he said. When I was 15, Union militia came to our farm. They wanted to know where Frank was riding. My stepfather told them he didn't know. They strung him up from a tree to convince him otherwise. He paused. He still didn't tell them. He was half dead when they cut him down. I carried him inside, and I thought the world doesn't arrange itself the way it's supposed to. The good don't get protected just by being good. The right things don't happen just because they're right. She said nothing. She knew this. She'd known it since she was a child, watching the way people looked at her mother. After that, Jesse said, I stopped caring about what people were supposed to be worth according to whoever was doing the measuring. I decided to do my own measuring. And what did you measure me at? She asked. The question came out more direct than she'd intended, but she didn't soften it. He turned to look at her. The firelight was orange on his face, in his eyes. Someone worth sitting next to, he said. That's where I started. Part 4, what she carried. They were 6 days from Pueblo when she told him about her mother. She hadn't planned to. It came out of a conversation about the landscape. They were riding side by side through a long stretch of flat golden prairie, and she'd pointed out a particular formation of mesa in the distance and said something about how her mother used to name the rocks. And then the story was already half told before she decided to tell it. Her mother's name had been Morning River. She'd left her people not willingly, but in the way that things happen on the frontier that aren't willing and aren't forced but fall somewhere in the terrible space between. She'd met Elara's father, a red-haired Irishman with a loud laugh and an enormous capacity for hard work, and they'd made something together that was real and difficult and loving. But the world had never let them forget that it was also inconvenient. The town we lived in for 3 years, Elara said, wasn't cruel to us. That's the thing people don't understand. It wasn't cruelty, it was just distance. Like we were fine to be neighbors with, but not quite fine to be neighbors of. There's a difference. One means they hate you. The other means they simply haven't decided you're fully real. Jesse listened without interrupting, which she noticed was something he did truly listened, not just waited for his turn. When my mother got sick, 2 winters ago, the women who might have sat with her chose not to come, not out of cruelty, just they didn't come. And I sat with her alone for 9 days until she died, and she was the bravest person I've ever known, and she died in a house that was warm and full of love but without a neighbor to knock on the door. Elara paused. My father came home from the mine 3 days too late. He didn't forgive himself for it. I think the coal dust was partly his grief taking him under. Jesse was quiet for a long time after she finished. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be sorry, I'm not telling it for sorry. Why are you telling it? She thought about this. Because you told me about your stepfather, she said, and it felt like the same kind of story, the kind where the world doesn't arrange itself right. He nodded slowly. The claim in Pueblo, he said. What are you going to do with it? See if it's worth anything. If it is, build something, a proper house, something my mother would have been welcomed into without anyone's permission required. He looked at her then with an expression that she still couldn't entirely name, that direct, river-water gaze that seemed to go further than most people's looking. You're going to do it too, he said. It wasn't flattery, it was an assessment. Yes, she said, I am. On the 8th night, Cole Younger found her by the fire after the others had rolled into their blankets. Cole was not a subtle man in most respects, but he had a particular kind of directness with important things that she'd come to appreciate. He sat down across from her and looked at her steadily. Jesse doesn't do this, he said. Do what? Bring someone, talk to someone like that. He waved a hand. I've ridden with him for 11 years. I've seen him around women, around people, around strangers. He doesn't. Cole stopped. He's careful with most things. With people he's especially careful, what he lets people see. Elara poked at the fire with a stick. You're telling me to be careful with him. I'm telling you he's careful with you in a different way than he is with most. Cole scratched the back of his neck. I don't know what to do with that information. I thought you should have it. Why? Cole looked at her with the kind of frank honesty she didn't often get from men who hadn't known her for years. Because you're a decent person who's been treated like you were less than that, and so has he. And when 2 people like that find each other, it either goes very right or very badly. He stood. That's all I had. He walked off to his bedroll. Elara sat with the fire for a long time. Part 5, what he said. She went to find him. He was where he often went when he needed to think slightly apart from camp, sitting on a rise with a clear view of the surrounding landscape. It was an old habit, she understood now. A man who'd been hunted learns to keep his eyes on the horizon. She sat down beside him. He looked at her sideways. Cole talked to you. Cole talked to me. He means well. I know, so do you. Silence. The stars were extraordinary out here, away from any town, the whole impossible river of them, blazing. In 2 days you'll be in Pueblo, Jesse said. Yes. And I'll be, he stopped, somewhere else. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him choosing words with the care of a man who didn't do this often and knew it. I've done things, he said finally. I won't dress them up. The newspapers make me out to be something I'm not. In both directions, sometimes a hero, which I'm not, and sometimes a pure devil, which isn't right either. But there's blood I carry that's real. I know what you are, she said. I've known it since Oakes told me your name. And you're still here. I made a practical decision. She paused. Then a different kind of decision. He turned to look at her, and she held his gaze in the darkness. Elara, he said her name like he was learning the shape of it. In another life, I would have asked you to stay. Ask me in this one. He was still for a moment, very still. That particular stillness she'd come to know as him at his most serious. You'd be marrying into a target, he said. There's a price on my head that means men will come. Always. I can't ask you to stand in front of that. You're not asking me to stand in front of anything. I've been standing in front of things my whole life without anyone's permission or protection. She looked at him steadily. I'm not afraid of difficulty. I'm afraid of being the woman who had a chance at something real and let it pass because the timing wasn't convenient. He let out a breath that might have been a laugh. That's a very practical way to look at it. I'm efficient, she said. You knew that about me on day one. This time it was a real laugh, quiet and brief, and she'd learned enough about him by now to know that real laughter from Jesse James was not a common thing, and therefore worth more than most people's. He reached out and took her hand. Not the brief, professional handshake of their first meeting. Something entirely different. He held it the way a man holds something he's been careful with his whole life and finally stopped being afraid of. Cole asked me, Jesse said quietly, whether I knew what I was doing. Bringing you, talking to you the way I do. What did you tell him? I told him I knew exactly what I was doing. He paused. That I'd decided you were worth the calculation. She thought about the words. The Hollies family thought my Cheyenne half was the part that made me less than what I should be, she said. I know. They left me at a fort for it. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his expression was the clearest she'd ever seen it. No calculation, no composure, just the plain face of a man saying something he meant entirely. That half, he said, is the part I chose. She looked at him for a long moment. The Kansas night was enormous around them, full of insects and distance and the faint smell of sage. Then I suppose, she said, we'd better figure out what comes next. Epilogue Pueblo. She found the claim. It took 3 weeks after she arrived in Pueblo, and the assistance of a surprisingly helpful asser named Theodore Banks who had a gift for maps. But she found it a silver seam in the eastern face of a hill that her father had filed on 2 years before he died, and which was, Mr. Banks told her with barely restrained excitement, considerably more valuable than her father had known. She built the house the following spring. It was not grand. It was solid stone foundation, 2 stories, a porch that faced west and caught the evening light. She planted her mother's medicine herbs along the south wall. She put a door on it that stood open during the day, because she decided that doors in her house would always be the kind that needed to be closed deliberately, by someone who chose to close them. She had helped building it. The man who helped her was wanted in 5 states and had a beard he'd grown to change his appearance, and he was terrible at laying stone and learned quickly. And every evening he sat on the unfinished porch and read Byron to her while she cooked. And once a month a letter went out to Cole Younger with a report on whether the roads were clear. It was not a simple life. It was not a safe one. But it was real, and it was hers. And every morning when she stood on that porch and watched the Colorado light come up over the mountains, she thought about a fort in Kansas and a wagon train rolling away without her, and she thought, good. Let them go. This was always where I was meant to arrive. The end. Estimated reading time, 28:32 minutes.